And so I climbed from the balcony I was on to one balcony over, and then one more. And then I huddled behind the partition, and I'm just sitting there. And probably 2 minutes later, I hear a bunch of men go into the room that I'd come from, and they were clearly banging around, very definitely drunk. And at one point, one of them came onto the balcony and said, "Well, where did she go?"
What is up? This is the Nook Podcast. My name is Steven, and it is such an honor to have you listening today. If this is your first visit to the Nook, welcome. I hope that it isn't your last. No matter the topic or the guest, my goal in this show is always to point to the saving grace of Jesus. No matter what you are in the middle of, this is a space where you can find encouragement and room to explore, learn, and share. If you ever have any questions or comments, you can reach me directly. The email address is steven@nookpodcast.com. That address is always in the show notes, along with links to the Nook Facebook page, my social media feeds, and to Buy Me a Coffee, which is a safe and simple way for you to support this show financially. We are wrapping up this back to school series today. This has been such a fascinating month of looking at the importance of regular Bible reading and study. I have attempted to come at this topic from a few different angles and tried to get at least a little out of the box in an effort to give you things to think about. I'm convinced that there is simply no better way to learn about the character of God than by reading His collective story. As followers of Christ, the Bible will always be our most trusted map. As we dive into this final chapter, I feel that I should give you a heads up that the subject matter in this episode is of an adult nature. There are some aspects of this story that might be a bit much for younger ears. Listener discretion is advised. Today, I get to share a most interesting story, one that you may have a hard time believing. Life for Ashley Lagos started fairly normal. From all appearances, she was just a good kid from a good family in a small town. She grew up in church, and her parents were involved in music and youth ministry. But things started to take a turn when she was just 4 years old.
Starting when I was 4 years old, I had an older friend who she was about 2.5, 3 years older than me, who started sexually molesting me from the time I was 4 until about 11 years old. It was one of those things where I knew in my young mind that it was wrong because she was very adamant that it be hidden. You know, like it was always things that would go on that were just happening kind of behind, in the shadows, essentially. And I didn't want her to get in trouble. And then I'm also thinking, well, like she's my friend, so maybe it's not wrong because my friend wouldn't hurt me. These very innocent ideas that little kid has, right? So what I say all of the time is that every traumatic event, and sometimes even positive events, that you go through in life, what Satan likes to do is he presents us with lies through that event. Meaning, in that case, basically what the lie that I learned that became embedded in my mind and in my emotions and in my patterns from a very young age was that sex was a tool that you use for manipulation. Because the way that the engagement would go is, well, we could play Barbies if you want, but first you have to do whatever she had drummed up. Or we could go outside and play on the swings, but first we're going to do this. So from the time I was 4, I just kind of had this idea that sex was something that you use to get what you want, right? Like that was my first engagement of that sort. And so that was the lie that got planted in my brain at that time. So fast forward a little bit, whenever I was 15, there was a very close family friend of our family's. He was around all the time. And essentially, my mom and dad were out of town. He stopped by our home, which wasn't unusual. I grew up in a very rural community. And so like ranchers and you help each other. It wasn't like how it is now where, you schedule if you're going to go to someone's house and you make sure they're home and you make sure it's fine. Like if you're in the neighborhood and you wanted to stop by, you just did. So him popping up when my parents weren't home wasn't unusual.
That man was more than twice Ashley's age, and in the absence of her parents, he sexually assaulted her.
And because I grew up in such a small town, my mom and dad didn't press charges because they felt like if they pressed charges that I would then be the girl that was raped. Because the town that I grew up in might have 1,200 people if everyone is home that day. Like if nobody went to a bigger city to shop or something. So, they felt like this is something that they felt like they were protecting me in a way. But two lies were implanted in my head through that experience. The first one was that men essentially can take whatever they want from you and they're not going to have any repercussions or accountability for it. And so you might as well just give them what they want because at least then you're in control of it. And then the other thing was I felt like the lie that I believed was that despite having these really amazing parents, because my mom and dad really are amazing people, I felt like maybe they just didn't love me that much because they allowed this to happen to me and they didn't do anything about it. And so those three lies, the lies that sex is a tool used for manipulation, and the lie that men can do whatever they want to sexually and get away with it, and the lie that my mom and dad just didn't love me very much, was sort of like a perfect storm, essentially, of just psychological, first off, trauma, because those were very traumatic events, just this complete misunderstanding and twisting of what sex was, right? And then I feel like I grew up, so I'm 42. I grew up in the 90s. I graduated in 1998, which was kind of the pinnacle peak of the purity culture movement in the Christian faith, where you had like I kissed dating goodbye and dating was taboo and you were like wearing purity rings and marrying Jesus and all of this stuff. And I feel like in theory, what they were trying to do is just get kids to understand that casual, meaningless sex is really not good for you. But what it did for someone like me was made me feel like, well, I can never measure up from a faith perspective because I'm already so damaged in this area. And there was very little room for like grace there because everyone's like virginity. It was almost like being a virgin was more valuable than being a Christian on some level because there was so much focus on that. So all of those things, as I progressed into adulthood, it was just kind of a perfect storm. And so in my mid-20s, I got married to a man who is an incredible father. He's a great dad. He's actually a really good friend. He was a horrible husband. And because of everything that had happened to me growing up, I had definitely walked away from the church. I just didn't feel like I had a place there. I felt very judged. I had gotten pregnant before I met this man with my now 18-year-old daughter, and the church was just, there was actually one sermon where the pastor knew my family and he knew what was going on while I was pregnant with my daughter. And he literally stood from the pulpit and said that women that were pregnant out of marriage were harlots, and that straight up, just straight condemnation from the pulpit. That I was definitely like, God, I don't need you. I don't need anything to do with you.
Though he was an atheist, Ashley married the father of that baby and went on to have a second child with him 2 years later. Because of terrible emotional abuse, the marriage was short-lived. Broken and desperate, this now divorced single mother of two felt forced to move to Las Cruces, New Mexico to be near family. Once there, she met a man who asked her to get involved in a new music business.
And he was like, hey, I really need somebody to broker these contracts for me. Would you be interested in doing that? And I just went full in. And I was building this very legitimate business, but I was broke. I tell people, like, if you could make broke into like 3 syllables, that's how broke I was. Like broke, like broke. But the business was growing slowly. And I ended up going to Las Vegas to broker a contract between one of my music producers and a nightclub in Las Vegas. And there was a business dinner. At the end of this dinner, this guy comes up to me and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in having dinner with me tomorrow night?" And I was like, thinking to myself, he's like, "I'll send my car for you. Come pick you up. We'll just have dinner." And I'm thinking, I'm broke, free dinner in Vegas. Like, yes, please. Like, I'm 100% on board with that, you know? So I go to dinner the following night. After dinner, I get in the car. The car service takes me back to where I was staying. When I got out of the car, the driver handed me an envelope with $1,200 in it. And I was like, "What is this?" And he goes, "I don't know. He told me to give it to you." And so I call the guy on the phone. I'm like, "What is this?" And he goes, "Well, that's for your services." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, you're an escort, right?" And I was I was offended because I was like, "Well, what did I do that made you think that I was an escort? You know, that just isn't. No, I'm not an escort." And he said, "Well," he's like, "don't be mad. Like, you're pretty and you're articulate and you're well traveled. Like, usually that's just the escorts are usually those things in these business dinners." So I just assumed. Now, looking back, I don't actually think he thought I was an escort. I think what he recognized in me was a brokenness and a desperation that I don't recognize myself. And so, I'm up in arms. I'm very offended. And he says, "Well, do you need the money?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I need the money." And he said, "Well, $1,200 is nothing for me. So just take the $1,200 and go home. Like, you know, my bad. Like, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you, but just take the money." So I took the money and went home.
It's no wonder Ashley was offended. An escort, or call girl, is a sex worker who, unlike a streetwalker, does not display her profession to the general public, nor does she work in an institution like a brothel.
And so I went home. I didn't think anything about it. Probably 3 weeks later, he calls me and he says, "Hey, I really enjoyed our dinner." And he's like, "I don't want to upset you or offend you." And he's like, "Said if I flew you to Vegas, paid you $1,500 a weekend, will you come back and you'll have your own room? We're just going to have dinners. Like, basically, I'm just going to pay you to come back here and we'll just date."
With her head still reeling from all she had just experienced, but still in financial straits, she asked her friends what they thought she should do.
And, I said, like, "This is what he's offering." And they're like, "Why wouldn't you do that?" It was actually, the agreement was $1,500 a night is what it was. So it ended up being like $3,000 a weekend because it was $6,000 a month essentially. And my friends were like, "It's $6,000, Ashley. Like you're building this business. It will, and you're not the only parameter for him was like he didn't really want me dating other people. And it was very much packaged from like arrangement. They call it an arrangement. Okay. They don't want to call it what it is. They call it an arrangement. And so the arrangement was, I would fly to Vegas every other weekend and have these dinners with him. And then I would fly home. And the first 3 months, there was no sexual or torrid that went on whatsoever. And then about 3 months in, he says, like you're here every other weekend anyway. Like if I paid you more money, could we just do everything that boyfriend, girlfriends do? And the only agreement is you won't have sex with anyone else. So he paid for me to get an STD check. That came back clear. And again, I went to the same girls, like, "What do you think?" And they're like, "Well, it's like there's a book called Trickle Down Morality that talks about how with every generation we come just slightly less moral than the one before us because it's not done all at once. It's just one drop at a time." And I think that in circumstances like this, it's the same concept, right? Like if he come out and asked me at the very first dinner where I met him, "Hey, can I fly you to Vegas every other weekend? We're going to have sex and I'm going to pay you $6,000 a weekend." I would have been like, "You lost your mind. Like, no, I'm not doing that. Like, you sicko." But that's not how it was presented. And I think the lesson in that is regardless of what the sin issue is, it's very rare that Satan is going to present something to you in the totality of the toxicity. He presents it to you in bite-sized chunks that are easy for you to swallow and digest until you are so hooked on what you're consuming that now it's being killed from it. It doesn't matter to you anymore because you are numb from the baby steps that you've been taking this whole time. I was in that space for sure. Like, well, I'm already seeing him every other weekend. Like, I already can't date anybody else. Why not? And that sent me down a path. Like, what happens in these environments is it starts off very glamorous and very pretty. And you're staying in 5-star hotels and eating super expensive dinners, and they're paying you a ton of money. But you have now been turned into a commodity. And just like any other commodity, whenever the newer, prettier, fancier version comes out, they want the newer, fancier version. Or when it's no longer convenient, which was the case with him, to engage with me, he had to move to Dubai for work, and it was just not practical. He was like, well, I'm moving to Dubai. I'm not going to be able to see you anymore. But what I'm going to do is give your information to some friends of ours that have had dinner with me and you at different business dinners that use these sorts of services. And so I got passed along to these men. And what people have asked me so many times, like, well, why didn't you just stop then? Like, why didn't you just say, like, well, this was that. I don't need to do that anymore. And it's because, just being straight up with you, like, it's easy money. And so, whenever a different person contacted me, I was like, well, I need to keep doing that. And so then you're lured in. But the problem is, to escort at that level, you're dealing with like super upper echelon, very, very powerful, very, very wealthy businessmen. And there's only so many of those. It's not a big circle of people. And so what happens is, after you've sort of been passed around, for lack of a better term, then you're like, okay, well, now what?
For Ashley, now what meant that she had not only become numb to selling her body for money, she continued to spiral and had to compromise even more, putting herself in some very dangerous places with completely unforeseen circumstances.
Well, now you start putting yourself in grimier and grimier situations because you are addicted to the money. And there's one story that, I tell a lot because it's just a prime example of how God works. I'd gone to Vegas to sleep with a guy who played professional poker. We'd had sex. He went downstairs to continue playing poker. I went to sleep. And about 3-4 in the morning, I woke up from a completely dead sleep. And I felt in my spirit, Ashley, you've got to get out of this hotel room right now. And I was like, what? So I just get up and I put my tennis shoes on, I grab my ID, and I go out into the hallway to leave the hotel room. And I feel in my spirit again, you cannot go out this door because it isn't safe for you. And I'm thinking, well, where the heck am I supposed to go? And the only other door was onto a balcony. And the balcony at this hotel, all of them, the front of all the balconies are the same, but there's like partitions in between each balcony. So I'm out there and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do. And so I climbed from the balcony I was on to one balcony over, and then one more. And then I huddled behind the partition, and I'm just sitting there and I'm thinking, you've lost your mind. Like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night. Like, you're chilling on somebody else's balcony in the middle of the night in Vegas when you should just be asleep. And probably 2 minutes later, I hear a bunch of men go into the room that I'd come from, and they were clearly banging around, very definitely drunk. And at one point, one of them came onto the balcony and said, well, where did she go? And in that moment, I just knew, like, first and foremost, that God was real and that God loved me, because the only reason why I was woken from a dead sleep and the only reason why I went out the balcony and climbed onto a different balcony was because God was like, kid, you got to get out of this situation or something really bad is about to happen to you. And I sat there in the corner, and I didn't, I wish I could say that I stopped escorting at that point, but I sat there in the corner And I don't think I have ever felt God more tangibly than when I was sitting in the corner of that balcony. Because I think first and foremost, I was 100% real with him. There was no hiding. I literally just sold my body. I was in a very dangerous place. I was utterly and totally alone. And he just stayed with me. For me, after the balcony incident, I escorted for 2 more years. And then what happened was I hadn't been inside of a church in probably 10 years. And I heard God the only time in my life with my ears say, Ashley, this is not the plan that I had for you. And I had so many encounters with him while I was escorting, of him being like, I love you, kid. I want you to come back. Hey, I still want to be in a relationship with you. Hey, I'm here. I haven't left you. Hey, like, let's go. You deserve better than this. And finally, I think he was just like, look, like, you got to make a choice. Like, you're either going to come back and live the life that I have for you, or you're going to continue down this road. And I knew from childhood that I did not want that. Like, I did not want to be turned over to anything. And I definitely didn't want God to not be, a centerpiece of my life. And so I Googled women's Bible studies, and I walked into a women's Bible study in Ahwatukee, Arizona. And I just started bawling. I mean, I hit the doors and was just boo-hoo, snot-nose crying. And the woman that was preaching that day was speaking on no condemnation in Christ, because God is always right on time. And I rededicated my life to the Lord that day. And I met a woman, her name's Donna Foster, who prayed with me when I gave my life back to Jesus. And she's been my spiritual mom and has walked with me. She's in her 70s, amazing lady. She's walked with me through 9 years, essentially, of repenting in the Greek and rewiring my brain and getting my mindset to align with the mind of Christ. And about 3 years in, she's like, Ashley, someday you're going to stand on stages and use your testimony to radically impact women. And I said, if you think I'm going to stand on the stage and tell anybody that I was a hooker, you have lost your mind. I am not doing that. Like, no way. And now I do it all the time. And it's not about glorifying the lifestyle, because there's nothing to glorify. I mean, it's a very dark and sinister world. But what I know is that I believe that sometimes the thing that God brings you through is the very thing that he wants you to use to go set other people free. And, the word is so clear that people overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. It has to be spoken out, because there's people that I can reach that nobody else can reach. And there's people that you can reach that I can't reach. If we live behind this facade of fake piety and perfection, and people are not able to see the sanctification process that Christ has brought you through, essentially Satan has won. Because you are hiding the very thing that could bring salvation to yourself and to multiple generations. And for me, that's the part of the gospel that I feel like people don't see, because we are not candid with what God has done for us. And that breaks my heart, because, I am a women's pastor, and 1.4 million young people leave the church every year. 1.4 million. The statistic says that in 50 years, Christianity in North America will be completely obsolete if it continues to go this way. And so as I do ministry, and as I'm on TikTok where young people hang out, and as I, just do ministry the way that I do ministry, I'm just like, God, what is it? What is missing? Because the power of the gospel is still there. And what I feel in my spirit is the reason that people are leaving the church is because people can't find Christ in the church. And it's because we hide him behind these fake facades of perfection that don't actually demonstrate the power of God in our life. Because if you pretend to be perfect and you never share what God has brought you through, and it doesn't even have to be something crazy like being a prostitute, it doesn't have to be drugs, it doesn't have to be alcohol. It could be maybe you were just a super judgmental jerk. But whenever you allow people to see the sanctification process that Christ brings you through, that's where people see the gospel. And that's the part that has to be, we've got to be better about showing that. We have got to stop with this fake nonsense where we put on these pretty faces and we pretend like we've got it all together, and then we preach at each other whenever we mess up. That's not what discipleship is. Discipleship is joining alongside somebody in the mess of their life and saying, yeah, you've got some anger issues, dude. I love you. I'm going to walk with you through it. But if you go to the bar tomorrow night and punch someone in the face, you need to tell me. And I'm not going to yell at you and scream at you. What we're going to do is we're going to go back through your life and figure out what lie you believed from trauma that you've experienced so that you can rewire your brain. Because that's ultimately how I think I've gotten from where I was and who I used to be to who I am now, and to the growth process of where I'm at now, is because I had to go back through all of these seasons of my life and figure out what lie did I believe from whatever season it was that became part of my psyche so that I could replace it with the truth of God. But we don't do that because we don't want people to know the lies that we believed.
The lies that we believe. That statement all by itself is something very hard to confront, because to do so makes you take a really deep look at yourself, a long look at the places where you have gone drastically off course, to the point where you are begging the question, how in the world did I get here? I know for myself that these are some of the moments when I want to run away as far as I can from God. But I'm realizing more and more that He continues to pursue a deep relationship with me, even when I'm in the middle of my mess.
It doesn't make any sense. And so whenever you reframe it and understand why the Bible is so clear on, renew your mind, wash your mind with the word, like do all of these things, it just makes so much more sense. Because if you change your mind, your actions are automatically going to change, right? Your actions cannot change consistently and permanently unless your mindset changes. And we miss that. We don't teach people that. What I have realized is that whenever we're discipling people or we're talking to people like myself who have just had these super traumatic things happen that have led to more trauma, essentially, as Christians, especially if you are in a leadership role or you're discipling people, which we are all supposed to be discipling people, if you are a believer, really getting people to understand that you do need to figure out what lies you've believed from different segments of your life. You do need to go back and say, okay, such and such happened to me. What lie was presented to me that I bought hook, line, and sinker that I have been operating under for the rest of my life? The truth is that God loved me so much that He sent His Son to die for me. The truth is that God loves me so much that He, and get into the Word and speak those scriptures over your life out loud so that your brain hears them, then your mindset changes, and then your actions change.
This conversation caps a month's worth of conversations about just how important it is to be in the Word. And it's not clinical, and it's not just, teacher student, read your Bible and pray. It's because of the richness. It's because it is truth. You talked so much about how you were believing lies. It sounds very much to me like you have replaced those lies with the truth of God's Word. Is there any way for you to put it into words how much Scripture means to you because of, in light of everything that you've been through, everything that God has redeemed for you?
Whew. I don't know if I can adequately put it into words, and as you see, I very rarely am short on words. What I will say is that I grew up thinking that first and foremost the Bible is holy, which it is, but also that it was just a little too deep for me to genuinely understand, right? That it was that you could read it and you memorize certain John 3:16 and certain books, verses in Proverbs, and like the quintessential Christianese. But then as I got out of escorting and then really just started getting into the word and paying close attention to the nuances of it and stopped looking for the religiosity truth that had kind of always been presented to me, which I always found pretty boring, and started asking God, like, God, I just want you to reveal to me the secret places of your word. I want you to reveal to me the things about your word that other people miss because they're so focused on the obvious. He doesn't want you to drown in your mess. He wants to transform the mess to radically impact entire nations of people. And that is all right there in front of you. For me, escorting was, and all of these sexual things that Satan has used since I was 4 years old to try to take me out and to make me obsolete, is the very thing that God has taken and has transformed to demonstrate his power in my life, but also to bring freedom to an entire nation of women who are hurting and broken in the same capacity that I was.
My head is still spinning after a conversation like that, but I think that's what stories of God's redemption are supposed to do. To take someone who was a prostitute and radically transform her into a pastor, a truth teller, is nothing short of remarkable. I have to mention that not only is Ashley the women's pastor at 12 Church in Southwest Phoenix, she's also got quite the following on TikTok, where she is constantly sharing this great message and people's lives are being affected. I think that is amazing. Check the show notes for links on where you can find out more about Ashley. The title of the October series of episodes is called I Suck at Prayer, because it's an area that I know I am lacking in, and I am not okay with that anymore. And I'm guessing that some of my listeners are in that same place. That series begins October 3rd, and I hope you're here for it. Make sure that you are subscribed or following the Nook on your favorite podcast app, and invite a friend to listen with you. Thank you so much for listening today, and I will catch you here next time in the Nook.
The Nook Podcast is a production of Sozo Digital Media.